Sketching life, using an artist's sketches of his family to document and interpret everyday clothing. When I began researching women's clothing for the late 1840s, early 1850s, I was attempting to find some images of women in their daily clothing. This is a time frame before published paper patterns would allow me to see the options for women sewing for themselves. Photographic images are still a fairly new thing, and most are studio images. Genre art was a possibility. However, I needed to find someone who painted in the era I required. I had seen an image called the Pioneer Cowpen, but where and what time frame it represented was yet unknown to me. After some digging, I discovered the artist, Richard Petri, and I learned he was living in Texas. Friedrich Richard Petri. In 1850, the Lunkwitz and Petri families immigrated to the United States from Germany, landing first in New York City. They migrated to Wheeling, Virginia, but decided on the destination of Texas in 1851. In 1852, the two families bought a 320-acre farm for $400 in the settlement of Pernadales, Texas, near Fredericksburg, and took up farming and cattle ranching. Petri had a lung condition and was never quite well, and as a result, many of the sketches in his sketchbook were his home life. He would die in 1857, so the artwork he produced in Texas places it in a very short time frame, making it very useful for observing clothing in that given time frame. I soon discovered that Petri had left sketchbooks which were available to view online. Some of the reason Petri's sketchbooks caught my eye are his eye for detail, the fact that his drawings were oriented around his family, and the fact that they were everyday images on the farm. All sources are not equal. While drawing and painting are good starting points, we need to remember that they are the artist's interpretations of their world. To balance this somewhat romanticized view presented by genre painting, drawings, fashion plates, and magazine illustrations, we need to look for corresponding research that reflects the reality of what we see from the artist's eyes, such as actual photos that show how the garments were worn, extant garments so that we could see how the garments were constructed, and swatch books, quilts, and textile samples from the time frame that allow us to see the color and the weight of the fabrics. Let's start with Petri's painting of his sister Elizabeth, dated 1846. This portrait was taken for the book German Artist on the Western Frontier by William W. Newcomb, Jr. The sheen of the dress in the portrait indicates that it is likely silk, and the shape of the dress is what we know now as a fan front, and it's a very common style in the 1840s and 1850s. Looking online for similar photographic portraits, I found this lovely lady with a very similar hairstyle and dress. The non-parallel mat reinforces the dating from the clothing and puts it somewhere about 1845 to the 1850s. This image was painted by Petri about 1851 or 52. It is titled Going Visiting. Elizabeth appears to be wearing her same purple gown as her best gown that was painted in the portrait previously. This was before any children were born to her. Elizabeth gave birth to a son, Paul, in 1852. The infant only lived a few weeks. The drawing is of her at the baby's grave. The photograph again is showing a similar style. Note that in the photograph that the dress seems to be a front-closing dress. The slender sleeves, which appeared in the 1840s, would remain a fashion choice through the early 1850s, with the last holdout seeming to be around 1852. These fashion plates from the late 1840s and early 1850s show some of the fuller styles of sleeve that were also starting to be seen at the same time as the slimmer sleeve. At At right is the pencil sketch of Marie Petri and Jacob Kuchler on their wedding day in 1856. The children there are Max and Martha Lundquist's, Elizabeth's children. Notice Marie's sleeves are fuller at this point, but the fan front or gathered front is still a popular style. The watercolor image is Richard's sister Bertha, completed in 1850 before he left Germany. Here we have an example of a fan front dress. This particular dress is a wrapper from my personal collection and probably dates somewhere between 1845 and 1850. The sleeves are cut in one piece on the bias and the front has a fitted linen lining, but the outer fashion fabric has drawstrings at the waistline to allow some adjustability. This is another dress from my personal collection. This purple cotton wash dress likely dates from 1845 to 1852. I used this dress to draft my Elizabeth pattern. Some of the fun features of this dress are the indigo dyed linen lining and its matching capelet. It is a front opening dress and the sleeves are cut a single piece on the bias or cross. The front lining is fitted with a single dart, and the side front overlay pieces are cut on the straight instead of as on the bias as is often done in the earlier 1840s. While white linen linings are common, this blue is somewhat unusual. I think it may have been used because the linen was misdyed. The blue has come out decidedly blotchy and uneven. I love the fact that this fabric swatch book from the Winterthur Library collection shows quite a few purple fabrics that are very similar to my Elizabeth dress. On returning to the original Pioneer cowpen painting that caught my interest, we noticed that the women were wearing an unusual bodice. When I commented on it, many would reply, "Oh, that's a short gown." Yet to my eye it did not hang or fit quite the same, and I started the search for an original to study. I searched through volumes of fashion magazines, read the English women's costume in the 19th century for clues on terminology, and scoured every site possible. It seemed to be closest to the half-fitting basques or sacques in my personal collection of antique women's wear, but there seemed to be slight differences, and this was definitely not an 1870s basque. This is a painting of the Ash Moses family, likely painted in Missouri, dated 1845. It is held by the North Carolina Museum of Art. This seemed very similar in style to the garments worn in Petri's drawings of his family. Both the mother and eldest sister are wearing something very like the women of the Pioneer cowpen wore. When I had the opportunity to acquire this garment, I thought it was very likely that the piece I had been searching for to study construction. The brown and blue ombre printed fabric definitely had the hallmarks of fashionable design from the late 1840s, early 1850s. The bodice was lined with a fine linen, and the entire garment was hand-sewn, unlike my 1870s half-fitting sacques and summer basques. The hip flare of the bodice was not big enough to accommodate the hoop skirts that would come in the mid-1850s, but it did lay okay over the corded petticoat I had from that era. The slightly body-skimming shape is formed by side seams that are slightly towards the back of the bodice and the center back seam. Although the silk fabric that make this is fine and sheer, there are many places that this has been pieced to allow enough size in the fabric for the pattern pieces. Comparing the bodice to the Pioneer cowpen painting shows a slightly shorter length over the hip area and longer on both front and back in both the painting and this original piece. The sleeve shapes were slightly different, but the ruffle at the hem and the sleeve hem corresponded. Looking at Susan Green's book, Wearable Prints, 1760 to 1860, I found several Dunster steam blue and steam browns that were very similar to the print of the bodice that appeared to support my dating of the bodice. Another swatch book from the Met Museum of Indiens des Organdis, French cotton prints, also showed several pieces that were similar to the print on the bodice and helped date this fabric to this time frame. Finding other images of similar bodices proved to be quite a challenge. There was one 1850s photographic image, and the painting Breaking Lent, A Friday Surprise, 1847, by Cornelius Krieghoff, which seems to show a garment somewhat similar to the Ash Moses family painting. I suspect because we are not looking at city dress, finding similar in Godeys may be a futile exercise. Godeys printed an article on dress in rural districts in 1849 that concluded by telling its rural readers, "What we ask of our fair readers is this: never to copy a fashion that is not suited to their means, figure, and the climate in which their residence is fixed. We tell them what is worn in cities, that they may modify and arrange the styles to suit their own comfort and pleasure. City ladies take the privilege of being independent in this matter, and why should it not be extended to their more blooming sisters?" In conclusion, studying Petri's sketchbook and comparing it to other sources has given me greater understanding of what was being worn in the early 1850s in a rural area. These observations show some holdover fashions from the late 1840s, as well as some changes in fashion to be more in line with what is being shown in the fashion magazines of the time. Petri's window into a life on a family farm in Texas allows us to glimpse into everyday people doing everyday things, and has allowed me to make better connections with the past so that I can better interpret for modern living history.